take a break and do business. And at this time, Sarah Jane will introduce our speaker, and I think she's got a few remarks she wants to tell you about.
Thank all of you for coming tonight. And Saturday at Dials Methodist Church in it's not Methodist anymore, Dials Church in Gray Court, we'll be having a program to honor its 72 Confederate veterans. And the program will begin at 11 o'clock. And then we're also celebrating the chapter, the UDC chapter is 100 years old, and it was started by 45 women in Fountain Inn. And we're honoring that UDC chapter as well as the 72 veterans that are at Dials Church. And also, Diane's going to tell you just a few things about what's going to be happening September the 26th at the Backcountry Settlement in Gray Court. And Diane's we'll have a ribbon cutting ceremony and also a dedication of the 250 sign. And that's on what time, Diane?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock on the 26th, and that's on a Friday, Thursday, on a Thursday.
It's about 2 weeks from now.
Okay, yeah. All right, and then next month our speaker will be Robin Farley Kuhn, and she has been very good about working with cemeteries, particularly the black churches in Lawrence County. And if you've been to the Lawrence County Library, she has at least 20 volumes on the different churches in Lawrence County. And she's done a magnificent job of keeping records of the cemeteries. And she will be here to tell us about that and also how to clean the tombstones. But we're honored here tonight to have Sheila Ingle from Spartanburg. And she is a well-known author and storyteller. And she and I have one thing in common. We're both born in Charleston. But anyhow, tonight she's going to speak on Eliza Lucas Pinckney from Charleston and talk about Indigo. And we're happy to have her here tonight. And her husband is with us, as well as her son Scott is with us back here at the back. So we're happy to have you tonight.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. I appreciate it. It's nice to keep coming back to the same place. I'm beginning to recognize faces now. Please don't ask me to remember your name, but I'm recognizing faces. That's about as much as I can do these days, it seems like. When Diane was state regent for our DAR here in South Carolina, one of the things that we did was for the national program is we had a doll that we dressed up, we told stories about, did a dollhouse for, all sorts of costumes, and the one that the committee chose was Eliza Pinckney. And so they asked me if I would write a book about her, a child's book. And so John and I got together and we wrote this book, Walking with Eliza, and it's about a day in the life of Eliza Pinckney when she first took over the Wapu plantation father. So I brought a few copies of it because John's illustrations are so good in it, and I thought some of you might want to look at it after I get through, but if you don't, that's fine too. Just wanted you to know that that was there. And I love what he did as far as the cover. There she is, just reading in the 1730s the way these women did. Just like, any readers in here besides me? Yes, a few, yeah. I have certain places in the house where I have my stacks of books. And John says we are definitely book poor. I'm not sure what that means, but he says we're book poor. So anyway, I guess it could be worse things. What do you think, maybe? So let's talk about Eliza. She was born on an island called Antigua. It was a British island. It's in the Caribbean. If you know your geography, and I had to look this up, I never would have known this, there is like a sphere of islands in the Caribbean. Did it go off? It's good? Okay. There's a sphere of these islands, and Antigua is down toward the bottom. But it was a British island. Her father was in the British Army, and that's where he was stationed. And if you think about then, I'm looking at 1720s at this point in time, Britain was pretty much in the know as far as having countries under their supervision, having islands and that kind of thing. And their main country that they were constantly jabbing at was Spain. So safety was an issue, particularly in the islands, more so than it was here in like Carolina. But they lived in British Antigua, West Indies as it was called. She was born on December the 28th, 1722. She was a Christmas baby. And her parents were delighted to see her. She was the oldest of 4 children. She had 2 brothers and a younger sister that were born after she was. And you think when you're living on the island these days, all the signs of the rich and famous come to your mind with the big yachts and the big houses and all that. And for their time, it was a very rich life. They were part of the gentry class, what was classified as the gentry class, which was just below, two rows down from the royalty. And the reason they were called the gentry was because they had inherited both land and wealth from their ancestors, usually parents, that kind of thing. And it was just going down through the families. So he had inherited 3 different plantations, sugar plantations, from his father there on that island. And then there's some other plantations I'll talk about in a little bit. But the thing about this island was, for any extras like books, like furniture, like clothes, toys, anything like that, that had to be imported from England. No Walmart, y'all. No Belks, no nothing like that. You couldn't shop online, so you had to wait for the ships to come in. You would place an order, and your factor, who was probably in London, would see the things that you wanted to buy and put them on a ship, and they would be delivered to you. And they did the same thing as far as Carolina was concerned, and what they got from our particular province was wood, was pork, and was beef. So they got some major things there. And their house that they lived in was not what we would call a mansion today. It was about 1,400 to 1,600 acres. I guess that would be a mansion, wouldn't it? Square feet. And it was 1 story, and it was wood, and it had like a thatched roof. So that doesn't sound very, rich and famous, but for those times and on that island, it really was. He also, one other thing about that island life that I thought was interesting, they had no schools. Now, don't let anybody holler, say yay or anything like that, but there were no schools there. So the responsibility of for the children's education was to the parents. They had to either hire a governess, a nanny, they had to teach them themselves, whatever worked. And then when the children were between 8 and 10, be it boys or girls, they were sent to boarding school in London. Think about that. 2 to 3 month trip across the ocean to a boarding school where you stayed and stayed and stayed. But before Eliza was sent to boarding school, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, she was taught by her parents. Her dad was a voracious reader. He loved to read. And I think that she probably inherited that from him because he read to the children every night. This was a new time when novels were just coming out as far as England was concerned. You remember Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, some of the first 2 novels, adventure stories that everybody was excited about. And so those were the novels that he would order from London, of course, and then he would read to his children and share it with them. So there was a love of education in that home. inquiring minds want to know kind of thing. And he was very open to answering questions. He was interested in the land also. He was interested in different crops, even though he had the sugarcane plantation. He was interested in trying to get other crops, diversification, we would call that today. And he would try to plant different things. And Eliza became interested in what we know today as botany. Now, most of you don't know me, but I don't do dirt, okay? I don't do dirt. Be it houseplants, they don't like me very much. And my sweet husband does dirt, so it's a good thing. And we have plants on the front porch and all that. But Eliza just really took to it. She liked flowers. She liked it. She was interested in what made them grow and what she could do to help them. Just a singular mindset, I guess, if you will, in that particular kind of science. So when Eliza was 10 years old, her parents put her on a boat with her cousin that was about her age, a friend, and a lady chaperone. You wouldn't have gotten on the boat without a chaperone. So they had a chaperone. And they took her to London, where she entered Mrs. Pearson's boarding school. I could not find anything about Mrs. Pearson's boarding school except the name. Have no idea about the name of the first name of the woman. Know she was married because of the name of the school. But there were lots of boarding schools in London at this time, some for boys and some for girls. So this is the one her parents picked out for her to go to. And they were met at the ship when it came in by the Colonel Lucas's factor, F-A-C-T-O-R. This was his business agent. All of these people had a business agent. They were in Charleston. They would have somebody that was in Charleston to work with them on trade and buying and selling. There was somebody in London that did the same thing. And this man's name was Bodycott. Interesting kind of name, Richard Bodycott. And he was married. And he and his wife became like surrogate parents for Eliza. So while she was there on vacations and things, she would go to their house, or they would do something with her on the weekend, that kind of thing. The school was mainly at age 10, reading, writing, and arithmetic. There was music involved. She learned to play the harpsichord, which she enjoyed playing all her life. I don't know, have some of y'all seen a harpsichord before? Or if you haven't, you've seen pictures of it. I know there's one in Williamsburg that we've seen a couple of times up there. I'm sure there's one in one of the houses in Charleston somewhere. But they're like a grand piano, and they open up, the lid opens up, and they're long. And most of them have two keyboards. Not one like the piano does, but two. And this was what they played before the piano was invented. So she became quite proficient in playing the harpsichord, and she enjoyed it. She learned that there. When she went to school, the language she was taught was French. That was the language at the time, was the French language, and she enjoyed French. She enjoyed translating. Can you imagine somebody that enjoyed translating French? But she did. She enjoyed talking to her friends, talking to her teacher about it, but that was one of her favorites, the botany. So that was what she enjoyed. She really, I guess you would say, she enjoyed school. Something to think about there, isn't it, when it's presented right and well, and students will enjoy it. So she stayed there for 5 years, stayed in London, did not see her parents for 5 years. She stayed at this boarding school and with the Bodycotts. And then she went back to Antigua, and by this time, her brothers were about ready to go to school in England. They were there for just a little while. She saw them for just a little while, and then they got on a ship and went to England to go to boarding school there. And her father decided that he needed to go see about the plantations that he had in Carolina, that he had inherited from his father. And so they came to Carolina, father, mother, Eliza, and her younger sister, Polly, who was 4 at the time. They came, of course, into Charleston, saw Charleston, a larger city than they were used to on Antigua, but not as large, of course, as London and what they were used to as far as London was concerned. Enjoyed Charleston. She said about it in one of her letters. She wrote to a friend, she said, "Charlestown is a polite, agreeable place. The people live very genteel and very much in the English taste." I think that's sort of a compliment to Charleston and that particular era of time, the 1740s, early 40s. So they met people, they met friends, they got to know some people, and then they went to the Wapoo plantation on Wapoo Creek. Go figure. That was the first plantation that he owned. And this one was one that it had, 600 acres. It was the smallest of the three. It was a 600-acre tract. And what the workforce was slaves. The land was mainly at that point in rice. They had a few other plants that they were trying out, but it was mainly in rice. So that's what they came to. The house there was lovely, and it worked out very well for the 3 women to be there with him. He took over the planning, what the people were supposed to be doing, what they were planning. And then that lifestyle went on for about a year. And after that, he was called back to Antigua. And when he was called back, he never got back to Charleston. Didn't know that was going to happen. But he left his 16-year-old daughter in charge of the 3 plantations. That one there on Wapoo Creek. Another one that was, 1,500 acre timber plantation, and then a 3,000 acre rice plantation at age 16. Now, I don't know about you, but at age 16, I was certainly not thinking about housekeeping. Just saying. Not that I didn't do some housekeeping, and washing dishes was my major accomplishment at that age in my life. That was my job there in the household. But she was taking care of everything on those 3 plantations. She was a smart girl, very smart. And she started keeping what she called a letter book. And basically it was a book probably about this size, maybe a little bit smaller, that she wrote in. It was like a diary of what she did during the day. It included receipts, which were what they called recipes back then. Talked about her visits that she made with the local people. And not only that, but each one of the letters that she wrote to her father to report to him on what was going on or whatever, or to her brothers that were at school in England. She was just a massive letter writer. She put a copy in her letter books. Can you imagine that? So she wrote her letters twice, and she wanted a copy of them to refer to. And what they did, they became a part of not only her history as a young woman in Charleston, in Carolina, but a part of our history too, because she was writing about things that other people weren't writing about and kept that record in her letter book. I think it's very interesting what she wrote in one of the letters that she wrote her father. Listen to this a minute. This is telling him what her schedule is for the day. I rise at 5 o'clock in the morning, read until 7, then I take a walk in the garden or the field to see that the servants are at their respective business. Then I drink 2 cups of hot cocoa. Then I go eat breakfast. The first hour after breakfast is spent at my music. The next is constantly employed in recollecting something I have learned least for want of practice. It should be quite lost, such as French and shorthand. Do you ever think about shorthand being used in the early 1700s? I thought that was something that we had to do in the 1960s in high school. After that, I devote the rest of the time till I dress for dinner to our little Polly, that's her younger sister, and 2 little black girls that I teach to read. Sounds like a very simple day, doesn't it? Starting at 5 o'clock in the morning. She goes on to say that after she does the school thing, they get ready for dinner, and after dinner she either does needlework, more letter writing, or she studies her French or plays the harpsichord. She had a very full day. No sitting around drinking tea is my thought there. She was a busy young woman. But this was really the life of any of the women during this time that had responsibilities. And she had the responsibilities of these 3 plantations for her father. And it's like she took to it like a duck does to water, you would almost say. She was intensely involved in it on a daily basis, and she wanted to do her best. She started planning things that her father had not planned. She started experimenting with different things. He sent her seeds from Antigua. Particularly, he sent her the indigo seeds. The indigo seeds that became so important to our particular colony during back then. That's why I wore this dress today, besides having a pocket, is because of the indigo. Our blue jeans, several of you men have on blue jeans tonight. The indigo is, of course, the color that made your blue jeans. But it had not been grown in Carolina successfully. Now, why was indigo important? Very simple. What Navy used indigo to dye their uniforms that was the greatest Navy in the world? England, right. And of course, England was their mother colony, mother ownership there at that particular time. And so to get them to buy from Carolina rather than buying from France was a big deal. She tried for 4 different years. There was a frost that killed all the plants one year. There was a fire the next year. And then the 3rd year, worms ate all the plants. But she was consistent. She kept trying. And the 4th year, she finally got a good crop, which worked. One of the things about her that I noticed in studying about her, she didn't give up. She really didn't give up. If she got something on her mind, she was going to see it to completion, whatever it was. All right, during this time, she was doing the plantation work. She was working with the indigo. She was teaching her sister and the 2 little black girls, because she was teaching them, by the way, to become teachers of the slave children that were already there on the plantation. That was her purpose there, was to do that for them. Now, during this time, you might remember that fathers arranged the marriages for their daughters, often for their sons also. And it was most often not a love match. Oftentimes, those marriages, they came together and they had never even seen each other. I mean, not literally, but it seemed like it, because they didn't know each other. The fathers arranged it all, and so it was usually had to do with money, had to do with land, that kind of thing. Well, there were 2 suitors that went to her father, Mr. Lucas, and asked for her hand in marriage. She did not like either one of them. Did not like them. And about one of them, she wrote her father and said, let's see if I can find it. Here we go. The riches of Peru and Chile if he had them put together, could not purchase a sufficient esteem for him to make him my husband. I think she did not want to marry him, would you not say? We might say for all the money and wherever, right? That's what she was saying. She was not interested. That was a little unusual also, to say no to her dad about who he chose to marry her, but that's what she did. And he let her get by with it. He did. So several years went by. She and her mother and sister, they were meeting people in Charleston. There were 6 big plantations around them. She met those families and enjoyed getting to know them. One of the families that she met was a couple by the name of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Pinckney, and she really enjoyed their company. And during the course of this time, her friend, Mrs. Pinckney, died. And when she died, of course, this left Charles Pinckney, her husband, without a wife. And believe it or not, within a few months, he contacted Eliza's father. Mr. Pinckney was 45, Eliza was 22, so there was a little bit of an age difference. Contacted Eliza's father, and guess what? Eliza said yes to this one. She liked him. They got married, and they married at a very special church. I know some of you follow my blog and on Facebook, and a couple of weeks ago, I wrote about St. Andrew's Parish Church that's on the Ashley River. It was built in 1706, still there, still services held there every week. In fact, they're growing. This is the place where they serve tea to raise money for about 10 days in March. The women of the church serve tea, and you can make reservations. It's on my bucket list. I feel sure that I'm going to get there one day because it looks absolutely scrumptious by the pictures. But it is the only cruciform church that is below Virginia that is still being used today. And the cruciform, of course, means that the sanctuary is in the shape of a cross. The pictures are beautiful of that. You might want to look it up, but that's where they were married and started their life together. They had 4 children in the span of 6 years. One of them died, but the other 3 lived. They had 2 sons and 1 daughter. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney was the oldest. Tom was the middle child, and Harriet. And I'm not sure exactly if they pronounced it Harriet or Harriet. I don't know. Wasn't living back then, and nobody can really figure it out. They spelled her last name with an O-T-T at the end. Sarah Jane, have you any clue on that? Thank you. So anyway, they had these 3 children, and everything was going well. And a few years later, Charles needed to go to London because he was not only an esteemed lawyer in Charlestown, he was a large plantation owner. His plantation was the Belmont Plantation. He was very successful there. He had built for her on Bay Street a huge house called the Mansion House. And there are a couple of pictures of it. One of those long pictures of Charleston, the scape there of the battery, what we know today, and that house is on the very end. It burned during the war, but there are a couple of pictures that you can tell it was a beautiful home. So he built that for her. And he decided he needed to go to London to do some business. So off they went. Charles Coatsworth was 12. Tom was 7, and Harriet was 4. I'm just going to say Harriet. She was 4. So off they go to London with 3 children. Another 2 to 3 month travel across, right? 3 children. Fun and games, don't you know, that the children had on that sea trip. So they got there and they started looking at boarding schools, because that was one of the reasons they were going, for the boys, not for Harriet. She was too young. But they found them for them, put them in the same boarding school. And so they started the same kind of school that their uncles had. And it was a good school. They went there, and then they went to Christ Church at Oxford, and then they trained for the law. This all took about 10 years that they were there in London. They did not go back to Carolina for 10 years, these two young men that went there at 12 and 7. Seems a little unreal, doesn't it? Their parents left them when they were, after 5 years, they left them and came back to Charleston. He had business he needed to do, so they came back. They brought Harriet with them, and Eliza started homeschooling her. She was just not willing to send her back to London with the boys. She decided to homeschool her. And obviously with this education that Eliza had, she knew a lot of things, the foreign language, the music. She was very educated, well-read, all those different things. So she started teaching her, and it drew a bond between the two of them that really never left. They were close as daughter and mother for the rest of their lives. After they came back, Charles caught malaria in about 6 weeks. And when he did that, of course, there were no real help for that particular disease. He died. And Eliza was a widow at 36. She never remarried. He was the love of her life, and she chose not to do that. So at that point in time, she started pouring herself into Harriet. She wrote her sons every week a letter, posted it, sent it on one of the ships that was going over there. She never failed to write them, to encourage them in what they were doing and maybe what they were not doing. You know, that's always, a mother tends to go there too, do we not, sometimes? And she sent them care packages. Now, I don't know about you. If you sent care packages to your children when they were in college, or did something else or whatever, took them care packages, loads of groceries or whatever. My grandmother, when I was in college, she sent my brother and I a $5 check every month. She lived in Kentucky. She owned a farm, and she said those were her cookies that she was sending us every month. And she figured we could buy our own cookies. Go figure. She was a smart, smart lady, and we really always appreciate. That doesn't sound like anything. That wouldn't even buy a gallon of milk anymore, would it? In some stores, but that's what she sent them. Now listen to what Eliza sent these boys. Large bags of rice. They liked rice rather than potatoes. So she sent them large bags of rice. She sent them large bags of sweet potatoes, okay? So 2 good starches she sent them. And then she sent them large bags of pomegranates, because they were their favorite fruit. Go figure. Now, don't you know that everybody was excited when their bags came from Carolina? But I thought that was so interesting, because she was sending them what she knew they liked and they couldn't get. And I don't know, I just thought that was really delightful. So after Charles died, there she has another plantation to see to, another home to see to, the education of her daughter. And the winds of war are starting to get gathered up in the northeast of our colonies. And think about it a minute. This was something that just hit me yesterday when I was thinking about this. Do you remember what I said that Eliza's father's occupation was? British Army, lieutenant colonel in the British Army. He became a colonel in those intervening years. One of Eliza's brothers was in the British Army. Would you not think maybe that Eliza might have had some leanings after her years in London, going to school there, with her friendships that she had there, with her background, her heritage of this British island where she was brought up? Seems like she might have, but no, not this woman. She was a patriot from the very get-go, and all three of her children were too. The two sons immediately joined the 1st Regiment, South Carolina. Both of them went up in the ranks in a hurry. Charles Cotesworth, as a matter of fact, the oldest one, he spent a year as George Washington's aide in 1777. Tom was injured. One of his legs was injured very badly at the Battle of Camden. And it was one of his British friends that he'd been in school with in England that saw to it that he got help from a British doctor there at Camden and saved his life. Now, isn't that something? You know, we think about it being so like this, but in that particular instant, the friendship was secure. And I just thought that was really nice to hear a good story about that. And it saved his leg, too. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but it saved his leg. Both these men were arrested. They spent time in prison as prisoners of war. They were sent along with Harriet's husband, Daniel Horry, who she had married, Hampton Plantation near McClellanville. People been there? Yeah? Hampton Plantation. That was their house. That was the Ory's house, Daniel Ory's family home. That's where Harriet brought up her children and lived during the Revolutionary War. It was in that particular house. It's so interesting. Charles Cotesworth married one of the Middleton's daughters, Tom. He married one of Rebecca Mott's nieces. And then, of course, Harriet, she married Daniel Horry, who was one of the descendants of one of the original Huguenot families that came to Charleston. Okay, I've got to backtrack because I've got something. When they were in England, remember I told you they went there to take the boys to England, she took some silk thread with her. She had worked very, very hard, as that being one of the diverse crops that she would be able to make money from. So she was able to get enough silk thread to have 3 gowns made. She kept one, and she gave away 2. One she gave to the Queen Mother as a gift there in England, and the other one she gave to a friend. There's no acknowledgement of her name. Now, if you go to the Charleston History Museum, you will see that dress that Eliza had made from the silkworms on her property. It is there, along with a pair of shoes that she wore with the dress. And Diane's got a scarf on tonight. Diane, can you show us the scarf? Tell them about it, will you, please?
The DAR chapter, the Rebecca Mott chapter in Charleston, took on the project to restore that gown that the museum owned. And it was like $25,000. And that's a lot of money for a chapter to raise, but they were able to do it. You can't get
Okay. The Rebecca Mott chapter in Charleston took on the project to restore that dress that Eliza Lucas Pinckney had, and the museum owned it. They raised, I think, about $25,000 for that project, and it was wonderful. And one of the members, Laura Thompson, designed this scarf. It was this color and this design, and they sold these, and she gave me this one. And then we went to the museum one day, a special day, for them to show it to us. It's just beautiful. And to know that she wore it, and the story you just told was fantastic.
Yeah.
Did I leave anything out?
No, that's great. Isn't it a beautiful scarf, though, y'all, and the color of it? I've not seen the dress, but the pictures I've seen of it, this matches it. And if you think about it, the elegance of a silk dress, you know, and to think that your silkworms made the thread for that dress, she had to have been somewhat proud of that, because that to me is a major something. Really is.
And I want to say Jill Templeton from Lawrence, who went to school with my boys, headed up that project. She lives in Charleston now. So it's all a circle and just a few degrees of separation.
That's it. That's it. Thank y'all. I just thought that was neat. She brought that tonight. 3 stories about the Revolutionary War and Eliza. She was a patriot. Her children were patriots. Okay, we've got that established. When the men went off to war, the 2 sons and the son-in-law, that left the women. So all the women pretty much piled in to Hampton Plantation. If you've been there, it is a big house. And it was big enough with pallets and that kind of thing for the children. During the course of the war, Charles's wife died and left 3 girls. And he made sure that the 3 girls were there at Hampton Plantation being raised by his mother and his sister, because he knew he trusted them. He knew the kind of women that they were, the intelligence they had, and he was glad to have them under their wing, so to speak. But the daughters-in-law, their children, everybody just sort of piled in. If you think about it, once Charleston was taken, at least they were across the river, you know, a little bit out of the way of the encampment there as Britain took over Charleston. But it did not keep them from being attacked by the British. Couple of stories about that. One story is told that during the war, that everybody was asleep one night, and Eliza had one of her 4-year-old granddaughters in the room with her, and she'd made a pallet on the floor beside the bed for her. I don't know about you, but I remember sleeping on pallets at my grandparents' house and thought we were the cat's meow as far as that goes. We thought it was wonderful to sleep on the floor. I don't know, but that's what we thought. It was wonderful. And so I'm figuring this other child thought it was great to be with her grandmother too. And so that was the good thing about it. And then all of a sudden, middle of the night, everybody asleep, one of the 15-year-old granddaughters came running into her grandmother's room saying, "The British are here, the British are here, they're after me." Eliza jumped up, threw on a robe, told the girl to get in her bed and cover herself up, got the 4-year-old by her hand and pulled her down to the end of the bed after she shut the door to the bedroom. And she told the 4-year-old, "Now we must be quiet." So they stood there. And just within seconds, this whole slew of British redcoats came banging in the door, yelling and screaming and acting like crazy people, you know. And all of a sudden they looked at where they were. They looked at who they were looking at, and there was this petite, she was a little lady, and her holding her granddaughter's hand. They just shut up. Can you believe that? They started backing out of the room. The last one out of the room shut the door. And they quietly went on down the stairs. Now, we can't say that they didn't do anything, because they did roam around. They picked up stuff, looted, did they not? Yes, of course. Horses and cattle when they got outside, they did that too. But at least none of the people were bothered. I thought that was pretty good. She must have really had a presence. Don't you guess? That she just stood there and just looked at them. I see her looking with her eyes at different ones, looking them in the eye, you know, sort of steely-eyed, looking at them one by one. And they just backed away. Impressive eyes, whatever, right? Another story.
Before you start the
Yes.
story, I need to make a correction. The chapter that raised the money for this was the Eliza Lucas Pinckney chapter.
There you go.
And I misspoke. The chapter that raised the money is, say that on your microphone, the Eliza Lucas Pinckney chapter.
Eliza Lucas Pinckney chapter was the one that raised the money to restore her gown and made these scarves. Yes, great. So the second story. One night, most of the children had gone to bed, most everybody had gone to bed, and Harriet was going around probably checking windows and doors, you know, the way somebody always seems to do at house at nighttime. And all of a sudden there was just hard as it could be at her front door, wooden front door, and made a lot of racket. She went to the door, very carefully opened it. Well, there stood Francis Marion. She knew him, and she said, well, come in, you know, come in. And he said, I just need something to eat, and I need a place to sleep just for the night. My men, they're already safe. We were being followed by a band of Tories and some British soldiers, and I couldn't go any further. I just needed a place to sit down for a while and rest. She said, well, of course, come in, come in. Supper was long gone, but she pulled out some things, took him into the dining room, fixed him a plate, and he sat down, and he went to sleep. Okay, there he is, Francis Marion, sitting at her table with a plate of food in front of him, asleep. Next thing she hears, lots of hollering this time with the knocks, lots of hollering. So she figures that it must be those British that were chasing him that had gotten there. And of course she shook Francis Marion, woke him up, told him he had to get out of there, get out the door, go out the back door. She showed him where the back door was, helped him get his rifle, pick up his other stuff so he wasn't leaving anything there. And she got him out the back door, told him to run to the river and jump in it and go to the island a ways and just stay there till morning and he ought to be okay. She slammed that back door, took a deep breath, I believe, probably, just had to take a deep breath, walked politely to her front door and opened it again. Bannister Talton was standing there, along with quite a few of his men. He, of course, was looking for Francis Marion, who she just let out the back door. Okay? So she invites him in, tells him to go, of course, go and look wherever he'd like to, encouraged him to look, right? Why wouldn't she do that? Because that buys Francis Marion some time, right? If they're busy looking in her house for him, buys him time as he's trying to escape. Smart woman, smart woman. So they go all over the house looking and doing and nothing. Don't find anything. And then Francis Marion goes into the dining room, sees the meal sitting there, tells her that he's hungry, he would like to eat. So he sits himself down, eats the supper that was prepared for Francis Marion, looks over at the bookcase, spies a book, John Milton's first volume of poems. There were 2 volumes there, the first and the second volume. He spied the first volume, and he said, I want that book. Didn't ask her to get it for him, nothing. He just got himself up, went over, got the volume of poems, told her thank you for the supper, and left with his men. I wonder if anybody slept that night, you know? Wonder if they did. Just wonder. And then we get to after the war, but still a story about the war. We're looking at 1791 and George Washington's visit to South Carolina. You know, as he went around and saw all the different colonies, made visits all around. And he, of course, you remember I mentioned that Charles Cutsworth had spent a year as his aide de camp during the war, so he knew the Pinckneys, he knew of them. And so they invited him, Harriet and Eliza, invited him to come to breakfast on his way from the South there. And he did. They got there about 11 o'clock. I think that's brunch, isn't it? But they had breakfast. A big spread there with all his retinue and everybody, friends and neighbors were there. It was just a party, a celebration. I mean, this was the president, and he was visiting. And of course, they put out all the stops. And after they left, or after they were through eating, they were standing out on that beautiful portico, if you remember there. It goes all the way across the front of that particular house. And there's a large oak tree there in the front yard that's always been, I wouldn't say an eyesore, but it keeps you from looking straight on and really appreciating the house so much because of its size. And so they asked him, what do you think? Do you think we should cut it down? Is it too much in the way? What do you think? The president said, oh, no, let it live, let it live. And so they named the oak the Washington oak. And that's what they call it today, that oak tree that Washington saved by saying it was beautiful is still there in front of the Hampton Plantation home. There were some quiet years after the Revolutionary War was over. Everybody was trying to regroup, just absolutely regroup. Her husband, Eliza's husband, Charles Pinckney, his papers and his library, they had taken to one of Tom's plantations at Ashapoo, and thinking it was going to be safe because it was further away from Charleston than any of the rest of them. Well, of course, no. The British found it, and they burned the house. They burned all the papers and all that. And so that was a tragedy to her, that she didn't have what was left there that her husband had written in his books, in his library, and that kind of thing. But in 1793, Eliza was diagnosed with breast cancer. And of course, back then there was little to be done. There were some doctors in Philadelphia that had done some successful surgeries for some people. So Harriet and a couple of the nieces went with Eliza to Philadelphia, took her up there. And she got so sick on the boat ride and up there that she wasn't able to have the surgery, and in just a little bit of time, she died of the cancer. Interesting note, she was buried, of course, there in Philadelphia. But President George Washington got in touch with Harriet and asked to be one of the pallbearers at her funeral. And they, of course, were just delighted that he wanted to do that, and he did. In fact, he came to see her one more time before she died there at the house there in Philadelphia. So they got to visit one more time. So I guess the thing about her, she never gave up. She wanted to learn all she could about everything that was out there. She was interested in so many different things. I know we use the word Renaissance man. I think she was a Renaissance woman, to tell you the truth, because of all the things that she did and that she got interested in, and she sort of took over, if you will. It was 200 years later that South Carolina finally recognized her. It was in 1989. She was inducted into the South Carolina Business Hall of Fame. And I think that was great that they recognized her. It was particularly because of the indigo, also for the silk, though, because she did very, very well with the silk industry also. And she pretty much set Carolina up to be a colony of worth. I mean, they were doing well. Charleston was always doing well with the trade and everything else. But it really kept the plantations going as far as the indigo was concerned. And one more quote I want to share with you. This was one of her granddaughters. And there's a book that one of her great-granddaughters put together. And I got this from it yesterday, and the granddaughter said, "It was always so in my grandmother's time. They tried to do things as if it was always so in their grandmother's time." What a legacy she left to those young women, and also the men in her family. Both those sons signed the Constitution. One of them Tom was the one that first ambassador to England and to Spain. Charles, of course, did quite a bit. Both of them did the lawyer thing. Both of them served time, as I told you a minute ago, as prisoners of war during the Revolutionary War. This family was definitely one of the first families. Can I use that term? I think first families of Carolina. And how much they did for us, to me, is just amazing. And I thank you for allowing me to talk about her a little bit. Thank you. I talked a long time.
Does anyone have a question that they may want to ask Sheila?
You couldn't after that.
Or if you would like to buy a book, you could
I'm
come up and
teasing.
buy a book.
Yeah. Or if you want to just look at one of these pictures that John did are gorgeous. They really, really are.
So she brought the indigo from where?
It came from Antigua. Her father sent